So I am going to go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Rowena Zimmerman, the Director of Communications and Outreach for Blue Ridge PRISM. And we're here for our winter quarterly meeting, and we are so glad so many of you have registered to join us today. I'm joined by a bunch of PRISM folks, including Rod Walker, our president, who's going to give a brief PRISM update in a little bit, as well as Lauren Taylor, our executive director, and then Tim Waywalt, our chief instructor, and then Jacob Edal, who is one of our invasive management specialists. Today, Blue Ridge PRISM is pleased to host our panel of experts, Nicola McGough, Patty Nylander, and Jennifer Souls, and we are so thankful for them for being with us today. So a few things before we get started. This webinar is being closed captioned. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the closed captioning signal. It has like a C and a C next to each other. And if you hit that, then you'll be able to see the transcription at the bottom of your screen. And this slide also gives you a few tips on what to do if you can't hear us. Basically, it's saying if you can't hear us, leave and then come back again, or make sure that you're coming in from Zoom. Some Zoom housekeeping. In the chat box, we ask that you only put in things like where you're joining us from, or if you want to share bits of information or websites you'd like other people to know about for information. If you have questions for Blue Ridge PRISM about invasive plants or procedure or anything like that, we ask that you type that into the Q&A box where we've got all the PRISM people there to answer your questions. And we have gotten so many questions. We got more than 100, several hundred questions from you all from the registration process. And we're so great. They were really great questions, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as possible. But of course, we're not going to be able to do that. But we want to be able to answer all of your questions. So if we didn't answer your question today that you sent us, feel free to contact us at info@blueridgeprism.org, and we will get back to you. Real quick, I want to talk about our next upcoming event. For the weekend of MLK, Day of Service, Blue Ridge PRISM is partnering with the Nature Conservancy, and we will be doing a training workday at the Fernbrook Nature Preserve. That's in Albemarle County, close to Stony Point, and that will be on January 18th for 2 hours, 11 to 1. All the tools and supplies will be provided. And we're going to be actually training on how to use herbicides to control woody invasives such as autumn olive. And so you'll have all the personal protective equipment that will be provided, as well as small amounts of herbicide for you to use and to train on. And then after that, you will go out in teams to work on a few of those actual woody invasives. So you have hands-on training as well as hands-on experience on how to do that, so you can bring that knowledge to your backyard. There are only around 20 to 25 spots available for this, because we want to make sure everyone is, that we can keep an eye on everyone. And this is a very, a wonderful nature preserve. Let me read this. It's part of the Old Growth Forest Network, which is a national network dedicated to protecting old growth and mature native forests in the United States for the benefits they provide to people and nature. And Tim Maywalt here was actually able to walk around it on Saturday, and it's one of the most pristine native forests he's seen in a long time. But the really good news, exciting news, is that the Nature Conservancy just added 150 extra acres to this natural area. They're able to get more land to add to that. And that's the part that we will be working on. So if you are interested, as you see on the screen, please contact Brenna Strand at the Nature Conservancy at brenna.strand@tnc.org, and she can register you and give you some more information. We're really excited about this day, so we hope some of you who are local can join us. So now I'm going to, Rod, do you have slides you want to share, or are you just going to be talking?
I'm just going to talk this morning.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to cede the floor to Rod.
Thank you,
He's going to give
Rowena.
us a PRISM update.
Thank you, Rowena, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to take a few minutes and just give a few quick updates about what's going on with the Blue Ridge PRISM. We of course just finished our Q4 fundraising activity, and delighted to be able to report that we did succeed in matching our two matching grants, one for $25,000 from the Virginia Environmental Endowment and another from a family foundation. So that's been very successful. Thank you to everybody out there who's helped to donate and allowed us to meet those matches. I'm going to say a few words about what we're doing in Richmond with the legislative activity. The General Assembly was actually scheduled to convene today, but my understanding is they've canceled all their activities this week, and they'll be starting up on Monday instead. Nonetheless, we've got at least four things that we're going to be pushing in this year's sessions. One is the signage bill. We actually had this through the General Assembly last year, and the governor vetoed it. We believe we've removed most of what he objected to, and so we're sending it back through again. And this is a bill that would require retailers to put signs near invasive plants listed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So if they're selling invasive plants, they need to post an appropriate sign indicating that they are invasive, and with some other information as well. So hopefully that will go through. This would be a major improvement, given that there are dozens of listed invasive plants that are still being sold in the retail trade. Last year also, we got through the legislature some money for 4 state agencies. In the budget negotiations, the money for the Department of Wildlife Resources was dropped. So we're trying to push that back through so that they have the money they need to beef up their invasive plant work as well. We're also going to be turning in a budget amendment for $100,000 to continue to fund our work with wavy leaf basket grass here in Central Virginia. And we'll probably also be turning in a request for additional funding for our drone research program. We've been working with the UVA for the last several years to prove that we can use a drone to fly over a piece of property and detect specific species based on the spectral signature of the reflected light. And so this technique appears to have done that fairly well. The phase 2, which is what we're seeking funding for, is to then connect that information that is gathered and feed it to a second drone, which would actually go out and treat the plants and actually prove that we can connect the detection with the treatment. The idea being in the long term to try and automate more and more of the treatment and allow for more cost-effective treatment methods. The one thing that's left over from last year's legislative session was we did get a bill passed and signed that required tradespersons who are designing landscapes and or installing plants, if they're installing plants listed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, they need to provide written notice to the landowner that in fact they're installing invasive plants. Again, the hope is that landowners would then ask, "Wait, gee, what's the alternative?" We're working through the regulatory process to get the regulations defined and implemented. One of the big activities in 2024 was we established the Virginia Invasive Plant Coalition. This came out of a 3-day workshop in late 2023, where we had 80 people for 3 days, representing 70 organizations from all over the state. The outcome of this is 9 action groups that we're currently working with to make further progress in various different areas. And of course, we are continuing our normal education and outreach programs for land stewards in our 12-county area. Delighted to also announce that one of our legislative initiatives last year got $100,000 to the Department of Forestry for them to assist in the formation and maintenance of additional prisms. Some of that money will be coming to the Blue Ridge Prism, we were told yesterday, which will allow us to undertake, among other things, 2 pilot programs to go out and document what it takes to treat kudzu, with the idea of documenting this so that we can scale it up to create larger, kudzu treatment programs. Another thing worth mentioning is that it looks like we have a new prism being formed in the northern neck, and there's others being considered, so that's good news. Another thing worth mentioning is the Loudoun Invasive Removals Alliance. Some of you may be familiar with up in Loudoun County. This is where we have more than 50 HOAs that represent more than half the population of Loudoun County, have come together to create an organization to collectively go after invasive plants. My understanding is there's a similar organization being formed in Fairfax County. So a couple other statistics, if you will, from a Blue Ridge Prism standpoint, as we now have over 7,000 people on our email list. We've had almost 5,000 people attend our events in 2024. Since we implemented a new tracking system in June, our 2 invasive management specialists have visited 78 properties that represent more than 13,000 acres to give them advice on how to deal with their invasive plants. We've updated some of our fact sheets. We've implemented a brand new website. And in short, there's been a tremendous amount of activity, and I want to thank you all for your interest and support. Stay tuned for legislative updates. We may be soliciting support for you to go out and inform your legislators that they need to support some of the things we're involved in. And of course, if you find our programs to be helpful, please donate. You are our primary source of operating funds. We are primarily, if not nearly 100%, donation supported. So anything you can contribute is, of course, welcome. Again, thank you for attending and enjoy the program. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Rod. And I want to reiterate the donation aspect from Rod, and also acknowledge that many of you actually gave a donation to support today's program, and we really want to thank you for that and are really grateful. One thing I forgot to say in the beginning is, as you leave today's meeting, a survey, a really short survey, is going to pop up, and if you don't mind just taking, it's less than 5 minutes to fill that out, so we can better learn how to serve you and give you the information and material that you are most interested in. We would really appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. Before I start, I want to give a special shout out to one particular group, and that is Trista Grigsby and her 13 students from Chesterfield Technical Center. They are listening together as a class, and many of them are interested in working in the invasives field and becoming technicians. And we just want to say, hey, Trista and Chesterfield Technical Center, we are so glad you're here with us today and really honored that you're joining us. Okay, so on to our show. Today, we are so glad to have our panelists. They are experts in the field. I want to just read a little bit and tell you who they are. We've got Nicola McGough, who's the Director of Wild Ginger Field Services, Patty Nylander, who's the Senior Area Forester for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and Jennifer Souls, who's a Natural Resource Specialist for Arlington County Department of Parks and Recreation. Just for fun, Nicola, Patty, and Jen, I wanted to say that since, a lot of us have had snow in the past few days, I've noticed a lot of birds in my yard, and I wanted to ask each of you, what is your favorite bird that you like to look for in the winter, or you like to watch in the winter? How about you, Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I would say that I like there's goldfinches, even if they're not as yellow as they are in summer. I get a lot of them right outside my window here where I work. And so I think that's sort of my default favorite.
Wonderful. How about you, Patty?
I know they're noisy, but blue jays. I actually
Yeah.
a cup full of peanuts out there this morning, and they were gone within like an hour. We've got a lot of blue jays in our neighborhood. Like I said, they're noisy, they're gregarious, but they're just fun.
That's great. And how about you, Nicola?
I don't know the name of many birds, just going to be honest. So, but I love
You're a
watching all
plant
the
person.
little ones with the very short legs trying to run around on top of the snow. So they're little, they're brown, they're very cute.
And I'll share that mine are probably the dark-eyed juncos because we only see those in winter. So I guess that's why they're called snowbirds. But I notice that sometimes if you're looking outside when there's no snow on the ground and you think, oh, why is that piece of mulch moving or why is that leaf moving? It's actually a dark-eyed junco kind of creeping along the ground trying to find food. So I find them delightful. Well, thank you for sharing that. And moving on to our show, I just want to say that as I mentioned before, we did get a lot of questions, but some of the things that we will be covering today include why winter is a good time to control invasive plants, what are some good winter targets, how to control vines. We got a lot of vine questions, so about English ivy, winter creeper, honeysuckle, bittersweet, etc. Hopefully, we will definitely touch on autumn olive and hopefully Italian arum and privet and lesser celandine. And we will do a really basic kind of primer on using herbicide because I know a lot of people don't know how to use them, including I'm not very experienced in them myself. And I'm so grateful to have these experts here who can tell us a lot more about them. And we will talk about, if there are people worried about the impact of herbicides on native plants and animals. And we always got questions about tree of heaven and how how do you start this whole process? One thing I'm going to say right now, and that's why it's in red, we get a lot of questions about stiltgrass. I'm just going to say categorically, now is not the time to control stiltgrass. So that is pretty much what we're going to say about that. That's something that we talk more about in the summer. But there are a lot of other plants to concentrate on now. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the first thing, one of the questions that we get a lot is, I didn't think I could actually do anything in winter because you can't see any of the leaves and you don't really know what's going on with them. Nicola, can you share with us why winter might be a good time to actually do some invasive control on your land?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons why you might find winter kind of inviting to get out and do some work. For me, it's not hot, right? So you're more comfortable as a human just outside. You can go observe and see what you see without worrying about heat stroke or just too much exposure. You can learn to identify plants in the winter based on their bark, like this picture is showing here, or their branching patterns, or the size of their leaf scars and various different aspects. This is definitely not sort of 101 botany, right? You're elevating a little bit into your skills. I would suggest if people are out in the winter and they're not sure what they're looking at, I love hanging up just some flagging tape or just putting a little notice to myself in the field. So I buy some flagging tape at Lowe's and put it around the tree and be like, write Alanthus on it and come back when the leaves are there. And that's one way to kind of teach yourself that this is the plant you're looking at. This you could be sure. Also in the winter, you can very easily see all the evergreens that are out. It's a great time because they just pop. So a lot of people suddenly realize in the winter that they have loads of Japanese honeysuckle, for example, because the green leaves are just so visible on the forest floor, or ivy that's going up along the trees. So it's a great time to see kind of the extent of the vines that you have going up your trees and the extent of evergreens. And so I think it's just visibly a different time to be out there and start figuring out what the species are that you have to deal with.
Yeah, and it's also, I imagine, far less buggy, so you don't have to deal with all those bugs biting you.
The ticks are generally not present. They can be, but they don't tend to be, and same with the snakes. And so it's kind of just an easier time in many ways to be outside. And then also for me professionally, it's a little quieter on the fieldwork side. So I have a bit more energy to explore like my own land and see kind of the stuff I don't have time to tend to in the spring and the fall.
Right. And would you agree that working in the winter is actually presenting far less danger to the native plants that are asleep around in the area?
Yes, so it sort of depends on the methods that you're employing to control your invasive species. But if you're using herbicides, and especially sort of foliar application of herbicides, so spraying it onto the leaves, there's a lot less plants out and awake above ground in the winter. And so you can kind of be more targeted in your application onto just the evergreen species that are present.
Great. Yeah, so those are some really good reasons why it's a good time. And it's easier to, I guess, you don't have to do everything in one season or 2 seasons to control, so you can kind of spread the work out. So Jen, I was going to ask you, what are some preferred targets for winter control of invasive plants?
I was just going to add to the good time. In
Oh,
addition
yeah.
to no ticks, no yellow jackets. We run into those more often than we would like. So good targets, I would say evergreen plants. A lot of people have mentioned that already. Things, whether they're evergreen year round, no matter what, like English ivy, winter creeper, that sort of plant, or that are basically evergreen in our area. So definitely all the evergreen vines, Japanese honeysuckle. Well, sometimes a lot of these get weaker in the winter, but they're still there, semi-evergreen, yeah. So they really pop out. It's a really good time to see them and to focus on them. A lot of times, if I have English ivy in the spring, summer, fall, I'm busy trying to get other things done. And if I'm not going to be able to cut off that seed source this year, I'm just like, we'll come back to it in winter. So come back to all these plants in winter. We're not going to pull English ivy off the ground in the summer. We've got other things to do. So evergreen plants are great in the winter. The other thing you can keep doing is you can, as you said, it's cooler, easier to work out there. You're wearing more protective clothing anyway. Doing just like physical removal, if you're doing only manual work of large vines, of bushes, of trees where you're going to be cutting them down, just more comfortable working conditions. It's easier to get to see the base of the plant and the vines sometimes. So some of those larger vines and bushes and even some trees. And then if you're using herbicide work, you can continue doing that in the winter as well, depending on your target species.
Okay. And Patty, can you share some more ideas about like what other types of vines or shrubs or trees are I know I'm putting them up here right now, but if you,
Yeah,
you guys want to talk about like any specific ones about these types of species that are best treated in winter.
Yeah, so kind of continuing on the vines, sometimes a concern people may have is, especially in a yard setting, a lot of times there might be poison ivy mixed in with some of those trees or those vines that you want to treat. And I myself have gotten some of my worst cases of poison ivy in the winter. But the good news is if you're already dressed for the weather and you're already wearing your personal protective equipment to treat invasives, if you are using herbicides, you're going to be protected from that poison ivy as well. It can be identified. It's one of the really hairy vines that grows up your trees. So don't let something like poison ivy deter you from doing your work. If you're wearing your PPE already, you're going to be protected from the oils that cause the rash associated with poison ivy. But yeah, some of the woody trees and woody shrubs, woody bushes it's a great time to get out there in the winter. Again, if you're doing the hack and squirt, if you're doing the cut stump treatment where you're cutting the tree and then treating it immediately, I mean, that is a lot of manual labor, and it's easier to do when it's cooler than when it's 80 to 90 degrees out. Another benefit of that is some of those herbicides, if you are using them, it can actually get too warm in the summer to be using them appropriately. So it's better to try to use them in the winter.
Okay, thank you. So just to recap, these few slides that I just showed and kind of went through are just some species that most of them are woody, all of them are woody, that you can actually work on in the winter. both with manual control or herbicide control. Okay, so since we're going to talk about that manual control, we do get a lot of questions from people saying, you know, I don't want to use herbicide. I just don't want to do it. I want to see what I can do with just my tools. And is there a way that I can be successful by doing manual methods? And we always say, yeah, I mean, it takes a lot more work. You have to be really watchful and, you know, go back year after year or month after month. But of course, you can use manual and mechanical methods for control. We talk about herbicide because can be much more effective and kind of a one and done situation. And we use such small amounts that it doesn't creep onto other things because we're really careful about that. But Nicola, can you just give us a primer or just talk more about the things that people can do in their own backyard with just using, you know, manual and mechanical methods to control their invasive plants?
Yeah, so the main thing about manual and mechanical methods is that if you're dealing with 100 acres of an invasive species or mixed invasive species, that scale might be too large or very overwhelming for manual removal. So then you might move into sort of the mechanical use of like a forestry mulching machine that you would hire someone to come in and they pretty much take down anything that's above ground. They take it down to the soil level. So that could make it more manageable to then proceed afterwards. I would say any manual and mechanical methods, they're going to be, obviously, they're physical, they're time consuming, and they require that you, excuse me, that you have pretty decent identification skills. So, you know, learn your plants and maybe you just learn them one at a time, but then you can start pulling them or cutting them or getting the roots out of the ground. Almost all manual methods will require a decent amount of follow-up, right? So it's not a one and done. If you had a small patch or a small scale, you can pull it out with your hands and then just make sure you come back every month or every, you know, at least every season and just check how it's going and if you need to continue pulling it out. What else?
Well, I was going to ask for hand pulling, what are the best, you know, what are the best candidates for hand pulling and what kind of conditions would they do?
Yeah, so hand pulling, you're going to want a small patch first and foremost.
Right.
You're still going to want to wear some gloves for lots of reasons, but like the poison ivy being one of them, but also, you know, wineberry and blackberries and a lot of things are quite thorny. So put on a pair of nice leather gloves. I would say, yeah, I would pull it, almost anything. It's best with moist soil. You're not going to go pull up a tree, right? So anything that is small for your hands to grab a hold of. I wouldn't worry too much if it's a grass or a vine or a shrub. If you're able to get the roots out of the ground, that's great. And there are root digging bars, whether they're small like a long screwdriver. I'm sure there's a name on it. Sorry, I don't know the name of the tool exactly. Or something larger like a crowbar to get the roots out. You know, you may end up kind of moving that direction. Wineberry, I would tend to cut wineberry and some of these other bigger thorny bushy ones, I would cut them with the hand clippers down to the ground just to remove the mass and then see what comes back and work from that point on.
Okay. So Nicola talked about tools and this slide has just an example of, you know, loppers and a saw and an axe. And the next slide has some kind of the elementary tools for if you're going to do some sort of herbicide application. And when people say dauber, what they mean is if you ever played bingo, when at some point in your life where you had like one of those sheets in front of you and you just had that, I don't even know what they were called, where you just had like a marker in there and you had to like mark all of the spots that got bingo. That is basically what a dauber is like. And if you hear someone saying buckthorn blaster, and you'll see that I made this lovely artistic arrow to the dauber, that's the same thing. So a buckthorn blaster is the brand name for a dauber that you can buy. One of the places that sells it is NASMA, which is the National Invasive Species organization that sells a lot of the stuff that you can use to apply herbicide. So somebody from PRISM will put the link in the chat. Sorry. So anyway, that lovely arrow is pointing to the dauber, just so you know, when someone says buckthorn blaster, they basically mean a dauber. And that just is a very targeted instrument to just put whatever just that blue part touches, that's just dye there, that's coloring the herbicide. That's the only thing that's going to get affected. So it's a very exact way to apply herbicide. And another thing that Blue Ridge PRISM uses a lot, especially with the cut stump method, is a spray bottle. Again, that's a very targeted way to apply herbicide to a larger stump around the edges. And also some people will use like a little drip bottle again. So we're really careful about what we use and want to make sure that we don't hurt any sort of native plants that are around. And one good thing about herbicide is that it dries pretty quickly. So once it's dry, it is going into the plant and you know, is you don't it's not like getting on everything. If you have any more questions about that, go ahead and type that into the Q&A. We've got a few herbicides experts on PRISM who are on hand to answer any of your questions. Okay.
I just wanted to, again, go back to the mechanical. One thing is people talk about the polar bears or weed wrenches. I would, if you're doing any kind of soil disturbance, even if it's hand pulling or using like that orange tool in the top.
If you think it's called a mattock. I forgot to say.
Okay, yeah, I think it was like a weed wrench or a
weed
something
wrench,
along those lines. The more soil disturbance, if you can just sort of tamp it back down, especially if you're working in a small space like your yard where you're doing it, if you can like stamp the soil back in place so you don't leave that disturbance present, because invasives love the disturbed areas. So you can sort of.
That is a really good point.
And it's less likely to erode if you're on a slope or something like that.
Yes. So. Yes. So remember to clean up after yourself and know that other living things are still around you, even though it's winter, they'll be coming up in the spring. So just remember that and put everything back the way that you can. We'll try to touch up on cleanup a little bit more later. Nicola has very kindly agreed to take us through herbicides because we did get a lot of questions about whether you can use herbicides in winter. And some people said, I didn't know I could use herbicides in winter. I thought it was too cold. So Nicola is going to take us through this slide and talk a little bit more on the this looks like, you know, a lot of these words, a lot of us wouldn't understand. So she's going to give us a more basic explanation of what this slide means. Okay, Nicola.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay. So even when I look at this table, kind of see a lot of gobbledygook, to be honest. I know what it all means, but my first impression is gobbledygook, and it's kind of off-putting, and you know, a little bit throw my hands in the air, and I don't know what this is. So I'm going to try and bring us in a little bit from there. I would say the average homeowner, if they're interested in using herbicides on their land, would probably start off with the product glyphosate, which most of us know as Roundup, right? It's from the news. It comes in a solution that's 40% strength, and the active ingredient is glyphosate. So you can find that if you just go to Tractor Supply or Lowe's or places like that, you just read the label and look for what the active ingredient is, and then you can be assured that you're at the 41% glyphosate or whatever percent they're selling it at. Okay, so that would be your basic Roundup that you would use often to foliar spray, so to apply to the leaves of plants. You can mix it with water. You would generally use it the label will tell you the percents you're supposed to use before I advise. The label will tell you the correct percents for different types of plants. But in general, you could be down as low as 0.5% of the concentrated strength, okay? So if someone says they want to use a 20% glyphosate solution, they're going to put half water, half glyphosate in a bottle. And that gives you half of the 41% concentrated. Hopefully I didn't make that too confusing. So read the label and they will instruct you how to get the right dosage for different types of plants. So that's glyphosate, and that is the main one that I would advise almost anybody to use because it's sort of the best understood. It is broad spectrum, meaning it can kill grasses and broadleaf plants, so monocots and dicots, and it is relatively safe. Okay, none of these are 100% safe or free for the environment, so you have to use them carefully and judiciously, and in the right weather and in the right way. Imazapure, I'm not very familiar with. So it's often used instead of glyphosate. It has a faster drying time. I don't like, when I read about Imazapure, I don't like the way they talk about the soil residence time and how long this can last in the soil. And that I find that off-putting. And I find glyphosate, for me, is a bit more managed or reined in because it doesn't have a residual time. Both of these will have a negative effect on aquatic ecosystems, so streams and wetlands, or if you're anywhere that the soil seems wet, right? It doesn't have to be a designated wetland. You can get an aquatic safe glyphosate. You would need to figure out what brand that is and check that the label gives that designation before you're sure of it. You cannot get an aquatic safe Imazapure. Okay, so both of these, they kill the same plants, right? All dicots and monocots. Then you move into the selective herbicides of triclopyr. The tricky thing about triclopyr is there's two different formulations. One is ester and one is amine, like shown here on the table. I always confuse these, even after 10 years of using triclopyr. So I actually made a little note for myself. So the amine one is aquatic safe. So its trade name is Garlon 3A, is a very strong chemical. You don't use much of it and use it in general to kill broadleaf, so trees and shrubs. So the amine version is aquatic safe, but it is more hazardous to the applicator, specifically to your eyes. So I try and shy away from this one in general because I don't like anything that is going to hurt me if I make a mistake with my gear or with my application, because that happens because I'm a human and I'm out in the field and I'm hot and I'm tired and distracted, whatever. So I tend to stay away from triclopyramine myself. So if I am going to use a triclopyr to kill something like tree of heaven, I would go with the ester version, which is Garlon 4. And I put it in a carrier oil like mineral oil, some kind of basil oil. You can buy it online. And then that oil will kind of stick better onto the woody stems of trees. You can use glyphosate or triclopyr in your hack and squirt or basil bark hack and squirt and cut stump, not basil bark. So if you find that you're using those methods and feel unsure of triclopyr or don't have it and you already have glyphosate, just know you can change your concentration of glyphosate and kind of have a very similar effect on cut stump and hack and squirt methods. Okay, so the last two here, the carrier oil, that's just an oil that you would mix the triclopyr in, like I said, to help it stick or get sucked into the wood when you're applying it onto the bark of trees. That method is called basil bark. So you spray, sort of a 10-inch swath the whole way, 360 degrees around a tree without cutting it. And then the herbicide is carried in through the bark and into the wood and kills the standing tree. It does leave a standing dead tree, so that is not applicable in all situations, like maybe some parks, it's not appropriate to leave standing dead trees. The non-ionic surfactant These are called spreaders or stickers. You don't have to use these, just to be clear, right? You can proceed with just the chemicals and reading the label and applying it the way they say. Some plants like English ivy have very waxy leaves, or cattails is another one, very waxy, thick leaves. And so the idea is that a spreader or a sticker, a non-ionic surfactant, will help the chemical kind of coat the leaf when you're doing a foliar application. There's lots of different types or names for the surfactants. When I do quick Google research, a lot of the surfactants are being blamed. I can't vouch for the research, but they're being blamed for some of the aquatic impacts of herbicides as opposed to the chemical herbicide itself. So be careful anytime you're working where there's streams, wetlands, or wet soils, specifically if you're using a surfactant. Okay, what did I miss?
Oh, no, that was great.
Okay.
I know. Thank you. And you mentioned about, some parks don't want you to leave standing trees, but of course, if it's your backyard and the tree is dead but not in danger of hurting anyone or falling too much and hitting anyone, it's actually good for the wildlife, right? To have the snags out there.
Yeah, it's very good to leave standing dead or even like woody debris, dead trees on the ground, but that would be a choice on your own land where the liability is yours, to kind of make that choice. So
Right. But just wanted to point that out for the wildlife. Okay, so you touched on the whole English ivy, winter creeper thing and how ivy has waxy soil. Can you talk more about how to actually start treating something like vines in winter? Nicola?
So I mean, the first, right, I'll just imagine that I'm at my farm. So the first thing is just to even walk around and start looking from the ground up the trees and start noticing where stuff is growing, from the ground up along the tree or hanging out of the tree canopy. I know at least from my house, I can see a bunch, unfortunately, a bunch of wisteria out in two parts of the forest that I had not spotted before. And I can, right now, it just looks like a very messy canopy. I couldn't tell you that it's wisteria, but I spotted the leaves a few months ago, so I know that it is. So I would look for any edge of the forest in general that has what I would call messy conditions. So just a curtain of vines going up along it or vines sticking to the tree trunks. And then I'd go back to that, like start trying to identify what you have. If it's really hairy, good chance it's poison ivy. There's some English ivy starts to look hairy when it gets big enough. And it tends to be stuck really closely onto the bark of the tree. And there's books out there to help you identify kind of the bark of vines and their twining behavior. So I would start just by identifying, trying to figure out what I have, and then know that any vine that's going from the ground up into the tree canopy above your head can be cut. And then you're fundamentally cutting off the root source, the nutrient source, to the vines that are up in the canopy. So that's a good first step to relieving the pressure on the tree canopy, even if you don't use herbicides. It's just to make a cut, of a few feet wide if possible. So you cut down near the ground and you cut 2 or 3 feet up off the ground, leaving a gap. If you are using herbicides, you would then put the herbicides on the bottom cut end, the one that's sticking out of the ground, because then you're putting the herbicide into the roots. I will say one odd thing that happened, well, two odd things. The first time I cut really big vines, I think they were porcelain berry, the upper cut, that was still hanging up in the tree started pouring liquid. And that really surprised me. It was just, I guess, the sap and stuff in the vine just started coming out and it was quite a little flow. So that was surprising that I hadn't thought about that. It did not happen on the bottom cut. And another time I cut English ivy and I treated the lower cut stump. And it lived for months and months up in the tree. It was still green and still present in the canopy. And I'm like 100% sure that I cut all of the vines that were down into the ground. So English ivy specifically has a very long lifespan, I'll say, after it's been detached from its roots, its soil roots.
Yeah, and so the pictures I just showed on the screen are just the cuts that you, I guess it's called a window cut, right? Where you have to just kind of make a space between the vines, like cut the vines and then, cut some out so you make a space between them so there's a gap. But if you do apply herbicide, you just apply it to the bottom parts, right? Not the upper parts.
Yeah, you just apply it to the bottom part. And English ivy, because it's stuck so much onto the bark of the trees, it actually is really quite difficult to cut and make a gap like this. So you primarily would use different types of loppers, hand cutters, and it's kind of awkward work because you're trying not to damage too much the bark of the tree. But yeah, you apply the herbicide using a dauber or something very specific just to the bottom, the thing that's going down into the soil, right? So the bottom end
Right.
of the cut.
Yes.
And then you don't need to remove the vines that are going up overhead into the tree. You just leave them there. They will die and hang out in the tree, and that's not a problem usually for the tree. So just leave them be, so you don't need to pull them down.
So as you see from the slide, there's the gap that's called the window cut. And then if you do apply herbicide, you would add it, if you can see my little arrow here, just to the bottom part of the bottom part. The top part here is just going to die on its own because it's not connected to the roots anymore. We have to make sure you know this safety tip. Please do not pull vines from the trees. You've got so many things that can fall on your head, and it's just not a safe thing to do. So just leave them there to die. Just don't, it's tempting. You want to clean up everything, but don't pull the vines from the trees. Okay, that's the service announcement for this slide. I want to read a question that we got from someone for any three of you, whoever wants to answer it. At what point in their spring emergence do we have to stop cutting and dabbing things like wisteria and autumn olive? When should I stop? So I guess we've heard that timing is everything. And when it comes to plant control in some way. Can you guys tell me, like, what does that mean? Why is timing everything? And is there a time when you have to stop doing this, herbicide control or cutting or whatever? Can you explain that to the audience? Patty, why don't you start?
Yeah, so typically the way a lot of like trees and shrubs working is, when they're in winter, they put all their reserves and resources down into their roots. And in the spring, when they're starting to come back alive, those resources and reserves are coming back out of the roots. So they're pushing upwards. So, typically once they do start leafing out, that might not be the best time to try to, do an application with the intent of it going down into the roots, because everything's pushing and coming out. So I would say probably once things start leafing out, you maybe want to transition to a different treatment option.
Okay. And so I know PRISM says, there's like in the spring when things are coming up, that's not the best time to apply herbicide because I guess the sugars are still coming up off the ground, and so nothing's going to translocate down into the roots to kill anything. So that you would just kind of leave it alone or hand pull. Is that right? If you can get the whole thing, you would just hand pull it out of moist soil.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly don't assume that everything has to stop. You could still do mechanical removals of plants, mechanical removal of bushes. You could still be cutting them. It just you may not be able to follow up with that herbicide treatment. But if you weren't intending to use herbicide anyway, it wouldn't matter. You could still do the mechanical removal at that time.
Right. So going back on our, what we were saying about the people who just want to use mechanical, spring is actually a really good time to do that. So try to pull out those young shoots or young saplings from the ground, and the soil is usually pretty moist. But we're talking about winter now, so I'm going to go back to that. Someone had a concern, and I'll read the question to you, about herbicide transfer to a tree. And they wrote, how do I deal with old grown in ivy vines on a tree? Will herbicide transfer to the tree? And how do I treat the younger vines on the ground? One of you help with that? Okay,
Yeah.
Nicole.
I can start. So I think it's a valid concern. I don't have a 100% clear answer, because if that tree is very valuable to you, then proceed with caution, right? So it might transfer, it should not transfer. If the ivy is growing up the tree, I would start by, making this cut for a start and not using any herbicide, right? So at least reduce down the amount of ivy that's growing up the tree. If there's ivy on the ground around the tree, I think you can feel safe in foliar spraying or pulling it, and that should not affect the tree really in any negative way. I would not use a Tricopure in a basil oil on any vine that's cut on a tree like this, because some of it will go in through the tree's bark. I mean, that's what the carrier oil is doing, right? It sticks onto the wood. So I would not use Tricopure. So I don't know if that's 100% clear or not, but I would feel safe enough putting some herbicide on the largest vines that are cut from a tree, and not expect the tree to have any huge negative effect, because the quantity of herbicide will be quite small.
Okay. No, that helps. I didn't think about that. So I'm asking Nicole a lot of the questions about vines, because I know, unfortunately for her, that she and I are, I know that she's working a lot on vines right now, because she and I are both working closely on the Rivanna River Forest Health Alliance project that's dealing with vines on trees around the Rivanna River in Charlottesville. So another question that we're getting is how, people are starting to realize that vinca, otherwise known as periwinkle, is a problem, and that it's not staying in their yards and it's going into the forest. How, do you use the same type of, how do you eradicate vinca that's spreading across the forest floor and through the meadows? What's the best way to do that?
I'll say that's when I hate hand pulling, because it's so many little pieces. Like compared to English ivy, it's much more satisfying to hand pull. You can hand pull vinca, but the winter is a good time of year if you are comfortable using the foliar application. Depends on the size of the infestation. If you have a small patch in your backyard, hand pulling, especially after like a thaw when the ground is moist, and you're just gonna have to do it repeatedly. The winter is a good time to foliar treat, things like vinca, creeping Charlie, other species like that. As a homeowner, you can kind of wait till you have a nice week of warm days, or a nice couple days where it's like in the 40s maybe, and be doing a foliar application, whether with a small spray.
Okay, I think that Jen froze up. Is everybody else still here? Yeah. So can one of you else just kind of follow through on her thought?
Yeah, I think she was about to say you could, the 40-degree weather, because it's nice and pleasant to be out, and you could locate your evergreen vines like that, winter creeper, that are on the ground, and just use that hand spray bottle, or a 1 gallon spray bottle that you buy at Lowe's, whichever you have, and some glyphosate, and that should take care of your vinca, winter creeper, English ivy, Japanese honeysuckle. And sometimes they all grow together. If you have land like mine, at least, they're all mixed in together on the forest floor. But if you don't want to use herbicide, you can pull them, and you can pull them to your heart's content. And I encourage you to find lots of children to go pull them with you, so you don't have to do it all.
That's true. If you can tell them anything you want about, like, oh, that's good to pull them, and they're good to go for a few minutes. And I like to tell mine when they were younger that this helps all the little wildflowers come up in the spring. So it was a nice little project for us to do. So we alluded to this when we talk about anything like what this photo on the screen is doing. It's really a form of cut stump. It's a vine, but I wanted to go a little more into what cut stump is. And basically, this is a I guess, combination manual herbicide procedure where you would, cut the vine off, and then you would add herbicide to the surface, just to, if you can see here, if you have a larger stump, you only apply it to the outside. And then the smaller parts, you probably use your dauber or your little spray bottle and apply it to the just the cut surface of the smaller vines. So when we talk about cut stump, or we're talking about herbicide application on the vines, or something like autumn olive, this is what we mean. So to cut it, or in some cases when it's larger like this, to saw it off. And when it comes to shrubs, as close to the ground as possible, and then to selectively add your herbicide so it's not spilling over, but just on the surface, on the outer surfaces of a larger stump like this, or I'm repeating myself, but the smaller cut areas of the just like the smaller branches. Okay, so that brings us to autumn olive, which is a question we get dozens of questions about autumn olive, especially here in Central Virginia. And this slide kind of takes you through the process of how to actually treat autumn olive if you are doing the cut stump method. Patty, could you talk us through this slide?
Yeah, so autumn olive, if you aren't familiar with it, it tends to be kind of a multi-stemmed woody shrub. It can range in height from anywhere from 4 to 12, 15 feet. It can develop into very dense thickets on kind of a larger scale. But even in kind of a backyard setting, you can have these kind of woody shrubs that develop. And so you'll have these multi-stems that start to develop. And you can see basically cutting those shrubs as close as you can to the ground. Given their kind of shrubby nature, you might have to make a few cuts just to be able to access the bottom of that shrub. So, just get yourself in there, cut those stems, and then as soon as you cut them, apply that herbicide like Rowena was saying, with either a dauber or a spray bottle. I think one of the really great benefits of this type of treatment method is it is extremely targeted. You are only going to be impacting the plants that you cut and treat. There tends to be, especially if you're using a glyphosate product that is not going to be soil reactive, it tends to break down very quickly. You're not going to have impact to non-target plants that you want to keep. And so it's very targeted, and it's just a very minimal amount of herbicide that is used in the landscape. So I think that's another really important component. The other great thing about this treatment is that you are minimizing your own exposure. You're still expected to wear your personal protective equipment, but versus something like a foliar spray or something like that, if you're using just a spray bottle or a dauber, it's just a very small amount, and the risk of your own exposure is extremely minimized. So it can be a really great method. That one on the far right, that basil bark method, is also a really great method. Again, you're going to be spraying to do that method. It can be really effective. And sometimes when you start getting to bigger trees, that cut stump treatment may not be as effective, especially with something like an ailanthus tree. You cut them and they just stick their tongue at you and keep growing right back, even with a cut stump. Sometimes when you start getting those bigger diameter, those trees that are bigger around, or even some of those larger shrubs, you may want to transition to that basil bark treatment. It's going to be more effective.
Well, that's a great segue. So, and before we talk a little bit more about basil bark, I want to point out for autumn olive, this type of technique is kind of the standard technique you would use for any woody shrub, for most woody shrubs. So we got a lot of questions about Chinese privet as well, and you would follow the same technique as you would for autumn olive. So it's pretty, it's a similar technique for a lot of invasive shrubs.
Bush honeysuckle. We have a lot of bush honeysuckle up here. We do this.
Yeah. So that's a great point, because we got a lot of questions about bush honeysuckle. So if you follow this standard procedure, this is something that you can use on woody invasives. throughout your yard, to cut as close to the ground, and then, selectively very carefully add your herbicide to control it, and it's very effective.
And
One
then,
thing that, sorry, was somebody saying something?
yeah, sorry, Ryan.
Okay.
I was just going to say, might be kind of obvious, but also you don't have to move the branches that you've cut and you kind of shove to one side, so you have access to the lower stumps to treat them with herbicide. You don't have to do anything with those branches. You don't have to clean them up or move them. They can stay right there. I know I have worked with some people, and it's a lot of work to move cut woody debris around. It's like you don't have to. That would be for your aesthetic. So once you have access to the lower cut stump, that's all you're really looking for.
That's a really good point. I know there are some, for example, what is it? The really bad one that you can't grow in England anymore.
Japanese knotweed. Yeah.
Right.
It'll reroot
You've got to
itself
pick
pretty
every
easily.
single bit of that up, right? But for something like these woody invasives, autumn olive or the privet, you can actually just leave them and they won't sprout. Is that right? Okay. So we do find autumn olive along, a lot of them are in the forest right near rivers. And we got a question of what is the best herbicide? I know that Nicola touched on this. What is the best herbicide to use in a riparian buffer area that's aquatic safe? So I know Charlottesville, we've got, a couple of rivers running through, and people are worried about that. And for all of you in Richmond City, I'm really sorry for what you're going through now with no water. So what is it that, can you just repeat what you were saying before, Nicola, about what the best?
So the label on the herbicide bottle will have to state that it is safe in an aquatic setting. If you're working beside a stream or in a wetland, or if you're standing where there's a very wet soil, even if you don't know that it's a wetland. So make sure that the product that you buy states on there that it's aquatic safe. And so glyphosate has an aquatic safe version. Maybe it's called Rodeo as the product name. I can't quite remember, but you have to read the label. And then Triclopure, the aquatic safe version, is the amine version, which is slightly more hazardous to the human user. So, read the label, wear your protective gear, and proceed with caution.
Okay. So thank you. I just thought that needed to be repeated as we talk about using the herbicides. Another shrub that we get a lot of questions about is Nandina, or some people call it heavenly bamboo. Patty, can you talk a little bit about Nandina and whether it's designated on the state invasive list or not, and what can you recommend? Is there such a thing as sterile or safe cultivars of Nandina, or is it just not a good plant to have at all in your yard?
I'm not sure. I haven't run across Nandina too many times yet.
Oh, really? You're lucky.
Yeah, but broadly speaking, like we thought the same thing with Bradford pear, that there could be sterile cultivars, right, and they did. Same with barberry. So it's kind of like Jurassic Park, like life finds a way. So
that's a good point. Right. So basically, if it says sterile, to be kind of buyer aware, because it will find a way perhaps to multiply.
Like it has a lot of other things.
Right. And there are so many other options like winterberry that also has beautiful red berries. So can you talk a little bit about, there was a new list that came out, right? Of the Department of Conservation and Recreation that added to the list of invasive plants in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, so really any plants that were added, obviously we're natural resource professionals would not be wanting to recommend those as a homeowner.
Right.
Those are ones that you're going to avoid if you're looking at adding things to your landscape. There's a lot of resources that are available online through different organizations, native plant societies and whatnot, that have really great alternatives to invasive plants for yardscape or landscape settings, things that are beneficial for pollinators, things that are well suited for, urban soils or wet soils or xeric soils. So, check those resources. Plants are continually added to the invasive species list, not only in Virginia, but I'm sure in other states as well. Sorry, this is a pretty Virginia heavy panel. But, just look for some of those resources that provide good alternatives to invasives. Look for natives that provide all those benefits.
And that's a really good point. And, and for the person who was asking about Nandina, Nandina is one of the 13 that was just added to the Virginia invasive species list. So it is definitely a problem, and it's recognized. So please don't buy that or plant it. I know we see a lot of it, at least here in Charlottesville. A lot of people have it in their front yard, but it does spread. Before I move on, we did get several questions about Italian arum. That is not something I know that it's been spotted in Albemarle County where I live. Do any of you three have any experience with Italian arum and how to get rid of it?
I have experience attempting to get rid of Italian arum.
Yes, tell us about it.
So it is something we've definitely seen spreading up here. We're sort of working on it with our volunteers working on it. We're just trying to cut it, prevent the seed source, just keep the plant weaker or at least not spreading. It has a very distinctive spike with the red berries or seeds on it, and just cutting and putting that, like disposing of that appropriately. Not cutting it and leaving that pile of seeds right next to the plant, but cutting and getting rid of that seed thing just to try to prevent its spread. I know there's been some research on different methods. Regular herbicide and just standard glyphosate or triclopyr application is pretty unsuccessful in treating it.
Wow.
The National Park Service up here was experimenting with adding, and I'm going to forget the name, metasulfuron to the glyphosate or triclopyr mix, and that was more successful. I can try to get the exact concentrations they were using, but I think that you're basically going to have to use a specific herbicide mix, not just a standard one, which then comes with potentially more risks than just having to mix chemicals. You'd really want to use your PPE, read the label, all of that.
Right. So you need to be careful when you're using that.
Yeah.
So would you say, can you dig it up?
We have tried digging it up. And if you have this in your yard and you have the ability to dig up your plant and then keep at it and keep monitoring it, I think you can eventually get rid of it that way, but it's not something that we found was a method that worked well enough to do it like in our woods on a larger scale.
Right. So it's a concerning species. Yeah. Seems pretty hardy. So I want to go back to Patty because she had started talking about basil bark, and not everyone actually knows what basil bark is. So I was wondering if you could just do a little primer on and explain to the audience what basil bark is and how it works.
Sure. Yeah. And Nicola had mentioned this as well with some of the different products in that table that she explained earlier. But a basil bark treatment is kind of, as its name implies, you're going to use your product and apply it to the bottom trunk section of the target tree. You're going to go all the way around the tree or shrub or whatever. It's going to be usually a 10 to 12 inch swath, completely drenching, but not to the point of dripping off, but completely, encircling the tree, with the idea being that that product is going to soak through the bark, get into that phloem tissue, and then go down into the roots. And that's how it works. It can be really, really effective for larger trees. Like I said, things like tree of heaven or ailanthus. Once they start getting into a larger diameter, one, you may not feel comfortable cutting one down to do that cut stump treatment. If they're too big, this can be a really great way to treat some of those larger trees if it's okay for them to remain standing dead. Again, as Nicola mentioned, you certainly wouldn't want to create a hazard tree in a high use area, but they can be really effective in like a forest setting, to just treat that tree and then it'll be a standing dead tree.
We also use it in our parks where we just schedule like, okay, we're going to come back in 6 months make sure the tree is dead and then remove it without triggering that response that Tree of Heaven has.
Yeah, yeah. And then as you can kind of see on the slide, like typically you are going to need an adjuvant or something that helps for the chemical to soak in through the bark. There's oils that you can use, mineral oils. There's some that are on the market. Sometimes you can use diesel fuel. Maybe from a cost standpoint, maybe diesel is cheaper, but it smells really awful. And I tend to say if there's a product out there that's a basil oil that's meant to be used for this purpose, I personally would prefer to use that. But I know some folks still use diesel fuel as an approved mixing compound for this treatment.
And
you
so how much are you supposed to be putting on there? So I have 6 inches, is that right? Or
Usually it's going to be like 10 to 12.
uh-huh.
When I've done it on
From the bottom up, right?
Yeah, at the base of the tree. Yeah, all the way around.
And would this work on bigger trees?
Yes.
So it does not have to be just 6 inches in diameter? Would it work on like a really large?
Yeah, I mean, I've used it on trees, Ailanthus trees as big as 12 to 14 inches.
And it's worked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I love to learn like new things about, about the trees that we're trying to address. What were you going to say, Nicola?
So it was regarding the big tree or the size of the tree. So I have used this on some large trees and found it worked. And then I found some of the Ailanthus, it was half dead, literally like half the canopy was dead and not the other half. And I can't fully explain why when I sprayed it the whole way around, but just a second treatment with the same chemical, the same method, killed it off. But that was a very, very large Ailanthus tree, the one I'm thinking of. So
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So when you're using it on larger trees, you have to be mindful that it's getting to everything and you might have to do another application.
I've
So
had the
that's,
same thing happen. And one thing
yeah.
I'll say is with basil bark, a lot of times like the smaller diameter, you can just maybe apply 6 inches, a foot of it. If you're going with the larger diameter, I might even do 2 or 3 feet of the trunk. And I have occasionally had like a tree live through it and have to be retreated.
Okay. Good points. So I have a question, and because we send out weed alerts throughout the year about the prime time to actually control specific invasive plants. Again, timing is everything. And one of the things we say is that Ailanthus, otherwise known as Tree of Heaven, is best treated kind of in late summer or before the autumn color comes in to have maximum effectiveness. So we did get a question about, well, should I even be trying to treat Ailanthus trees or Tree of Heaven in winter? And what would you say to that? Is the dormant season, is it effective to try to treat Ailanthus now? Or, will it even get to the root to kill them?
We do hack and squirt or basil bark until late February, early March. Certainly once the sap starts going up the tree, we quit doing any kind of cut stump work until again into summer. But
Right.
As long as the temperature, again, for a homeowner, I would go for the 40s. You don't have to be out there when it's 20 degrees, but we'll do this work in 30-degree temperature.
Right. Nicola?
yeah, so I think you can so I think 2 things. One, if I think you can do it year round. I think it is a lot less effective in the spring when the sap is rising. But if the only time that you can get out and do the work and it happens to be April, I still think it's valid to try and you will get some success with it, but not as much as in the fall. Then saying that, if you're trying to be as careful and judicious as possible with your use of herbicides and you're looking for like the most effective time of year, will be the September timeframe when the trees and shrubs are all translocating down, all their energy down into their roots. So I wouldn't let the time of year stop you. If it's, you're just dying to get out there and do something, go for it. You're not going to do too much harm, but it just might not be as effective.
Thank you. That was something I really wanted to touch on. So, okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was hack and squirt, because that is the main way we at PRISM tend to treat tree of heaven, or Atlantis as we call it. Patty, can you talk a little bit about hack and squirt and the correct method that people can use when they're trying to utilize herbicides on a tree such as tree of heaven or Callery pear?
Yeah, so again, one of the great things about this application method is it doesn't require really specific fancy tools. You can get these tools at your local hardware store very readily. It requires a hand axe and a spray bottle, and then your PPE. But the tools are really easily acquired, and it basically just involves finding the tree that you want to treat. You're going to make those chop marks and make sure that you're making it kind of at that angle as indicated in the photograph. And then as soon as you make those chop marks, you're going to spray a concentrated version of herbicide into those chopped marks. With larger, you can do it with any size tree. With larger trees, you want to try and get more chop marks, maybe 1 to 2 inches in between each chop. You're not trying to cut the thing down. The purpose of the chop is basically to access the phloem tissue that is just under the surface of the bark and under the surface, near the cambium layer, where those living cells reside. That's where you're trying to get to. So the chops don't need to be incredibly deep. You just enough to access that area, apply the herbicide, and it should be good. This is a great method. You don't have to lean over. So, and again, it's a standing dead tree. If you're okay to leave it standing there, it's fine, but you can actually work through an area pretty efficiently with this method.
Right, you don't have to lean over, because I guess the general consensus is that to make these hacks at around waist level, your waist level area. So, you're just kind of standing there doing that. But I know the PRISM has used this method successfully for Atlantis or Tree of Heaven a lot. And I wanted to make sure that everyone saw that this was a method that you could use for the larger trees when you can't cut everything off. One, for Tree of Heaven, you don't want to cut everything off. So, because then it just kind of responds and puts up more sprouts. So you kind of have to fool it and say, oh, I'm just a little sick, I'll try to recover. And it won't kind of like put up all the other little saplings up. So this is a really good method for that particular tree. Okay, moving on. So towards the end of winter, as it gets warmer and warmer in our area, we've noticed that these forbs are coming up even when it's actually still winter, in February. One of the biggest questions we get, or most questions we get, is about lesser celandine, because it's so harmful to a lot of the riverbank in our area, because it just spreads so quickly. And more importantly, it kind of crowds out all of the ephemerals, otherwise known as the spring native wildflowers that are usually there along the banks. So, Jen, can you talk a little bit more about, you're from Arlington, what you all are doing to deal with lesser celandine?
Sure. I also, before I forget, want to just say, if you're looking for celandine, keep an eye out for incised fumewort. It's in the same area, and it's a new invasive in our area. So that's when you actually, if you don't, you may not have either of these, but if you have celandine, also you might want to keep an eye out at the same time for the fumewort, which has a purple flower.
That's a good point. So if you see one, you probably will see the other. Great.
We tend to see them in
That's
the same
uplifting.
in the same riparian floodplain. We see celandine in other places. I see it in my neighbor's yard, and in like little all sorts of places all over Arlington. But definitely, they like that same kind of plant community. For us, celandine, I would say if you have a single plant or you just have a few plants, you can hand dig it, or if it's in very sort of sandy soil. It has little tiny tubers, and there's lots of videos out there showing this, or information out there, but you can't just hand pull it. You have to like kind of make sure that you're getting all the little tubers and bulbils that are associated with it that will break off and remain in the soil. So if you just have a few, it is possible to hand dig it. And again, you can keep monitoring that and doing that repeatedly. once you get to larger infestations, we are treating it with a fairly low percent, like 2% glyphosate solution, aquatic safe, because wherever we just always use aquatic safe glyphosate no matter where we are, but especially if we're in that riparian zone, you want to be doing that, which is usually where this plant is. And you can treat some of these other plants at the same time. I would say that with garlic mustard, the one thing to be careful of is that first year rosette will look like violets to people, and violets will look like garlic mustard. It's possible to learn the difference, but at a first glance, that's one that we sometimes see get confused and mistakenly
Really?
pulled or treated.
Okay.
So, and if I only have so much time and energy in a space, I'll sometimes wait for the garlic mustard just another month or two into spring when the second year plants start bolting, and I need to get them before they go to seed if I don't have the ability to pull all the garlic mustard, whether it's first or second year in the winter. But if I have time and energy, yeah, I definitely go for that.
Okay.
And with the celandine, I would also say we are using a surfactant because just like ivy, the leaves can have a little bit of that sort of glossiness.
Mhm.
Ideally, you would treat it when about half the plants are in bloom, which
Really?
is a very narrow, like they say that's most successful. That's a very tight timing window. So we
Yeah.
end up treating it basically from as soon as we get the contractors out there, switched from other work over to that, late February if it's up, maybe early March, all the way through the end of April. But if you have, again, the luxury of timing your treatment to that sort of like half in bloom on your property, that'd be great, I think.
So that's a really good point. So if you have a celandine problem, then when it's half in bloom, that would probably be the most effective time to do it. And it seems that when you do have a lot, one of the options that you can use if you are using herbicide is foliar spray, which you can see in this photo is being used. And we just want to make the point that this is a really good example, not just of the foliar spray, but of someone using PPE, which is personal protection equipment. Always do this. So always wear your hat, long sleeves, boots, gloves, glasses, at least closed-toe shoes, so that you are protected from the herbicide. We want to make sure that you are applying it safely. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we did touch on herbicide safety. Again, PPE means personal protection equipment, which means gloves, long sleeves, pants, closed-toe shoes, socks, eye covering, and a hat. So when you're using herbicide, please suit up to protect yourself and make sure, if there's like any sort of a breeze and, anything, comes back at you that you're covered up. Nicola, I think for many people, the label is really confusing. What does it mean when you say read and, we're saying read and understand the label? And one of the things that jumped out at me is signal word. What is a signal word?
So I'm just going to rewind a little bit. The label is going to be stuck on the bottle.
Yes.
It's very similar to like a pharmaceutical label, right? Where you peel it and then there's all of a sudden 20 pages, in between the front and the back stuck on the bottle. It is worth taking your time, put on your reading glasses, and actually read what the label says kind of from start to finish, even if it's boring. If you haven't read it in a month or two since the last time you used it, give it a look again, right? I have read the same labels, I don't know how many times, because I forget and I confuse one herbicide with another, or I just need to remind myself of what I'm doing. So kind of count that into your prep time before you start mixing stuff in bottles or spraying. The signal words are going to tell you kind of the hazard of the product that you're working with, right? So the hazard to yourself, but also to the environment. And so if there's anything on the label you don't understand, like your signal word, then get your phone and Google it, start trying to understand if you're going to use these products, and try and understand what you're working with, what you're in the middle of, and don't just ignore stuff on the label because you don't understand it. So it is, if you're applying herbicides, it's your legal obligation, I believe, to understand the label. So kind of can't stress that enough. And it is confusing and overwhelming and has loads of information that probably doesn't pertain to what you're doing on that day, but it's still worth kind of having a look at. They'll have a little summary page up front. They have the table there showing the active ingredient, and then they'll tell you kind of rates of mixing it up to get different percents, so as you're not just kind of left on your own to figure it out. So yeah, I encourage you all, go read the label. Also, if you are pouring herbicides, you know, to make certain percents into a spray bottle or a dauber bottle or your backpack spray or anything, I would always recommend getting a Sharpie or some kind of label on that container for yourself, because if you're like me, you won't remember by tomorrow or by dinner time today, realistically, what you even put in the bottle. So just write it on there with a little date for yourself that this is 20% glyphosate solution or 2% triclopyr or whatever it is you're working with. So as you are very clear next time even if next time is tomorrow, that you come back to your mixed solution, that you know what you have done.
Right. And so, for example, in this thing, it says glyphosate solution, 41%. So a lot of the time, for example, in our upcoming workday, we're going to be using around a 25% glyphosate solution for the woody invasives we're going to be working on in Fernbrook. So what you would do is do a 50-50%. So half glyphosate, or half of this thing in your spray bottle and half water. And that's how you would get around your 20%. Okay. So we only have a few minutes left, and this can be a really overwhelming topic. Everybody wants to do the right thing and know how to do it. So I wanted to ask the three of you to share your best practices in winter. So if you, what would be your 3 best practices in winter? What would be the 3 first things you would do in your yard if you wanted to just kind of tackle just what you have in your backyard? I'm going to start with you, Jen.
Okay, so let's see. I'd say one thing to remember is if it's horrible weather out, winter is a great time to just learn more, to go to some of those webinars that have been recorded and watch them, you know, on a snowy day or something like that. So that's a good winter practice, is to just take the time when you can't go and work outside, or you only work outside for a shorter period, to just educate yourself more about these plants and just about the practices in general, what's happening at the state level, all of that. For me, I use those nice winter days to go out and pull the periwinkle and ivy that's still in my yard and still creeping back into my yard. I am keeping an eye out on where my neighbor's celandine comes into my yard. So as soon as that comes up, I actually just throw it back over the fence, but you shouldn't do that.
I wonder if your neighbor's watching now.
It's a rental property. There's no landlord really around. So hopefully they not see me do that. Don't do that. So I would say those are the things that I tend to do. I've already gotten like the ivy off the trees in my yard, and so I've already done that initial save the trees first triage.
And how do you stay warm on days like this? It's freezing out there. Do you just, any tricks to staying warm out there as you're doing your work?
Well, that's one reason that doing this cut work can be a good thing to do in the winter, is you're moving around, cutting, especially smaller things, and then daubing and move and cut. And it keeps you moving a little faster than if you're sitting in one place picking at periwinkle. Mm-hmm. So, but for me, I just, I dress warmly, wear wool socks.
Right.
Keep moving, take breaks,
Sounds good. And how about you, Patty? What would be your 3 best practices, or the 3 things that you would recommend you start doing first in your backyard?
Just to kind of echo what Jen said, sticking with that, cutting options, if there are days that are maybe closer to the 40s, not in the 20s, and when we have, 6 inches of snow on the ground, certainly not a time to be applying things. Just, but yeah.
Stay inside with your cocoa, right?
That's right. Yeah. So just, focusing on those cutting options, even for the things that can't be treated with herbicide, something like kudzu, if you've got some of that, like just work on pulling some of that out and getting it out of the way, in preparation for things that you can do once it starts leafing out again.
That's a really good point to, cut some stuff back so it's not so overwhelming in the spring when you do treat it. Good point. And how about you, Nicola? What are your top 3 best practices in winter that maybe if you're getting started, people should start with?
Yeah, I don't know that it's best practice, but it's what I tend to be doing.
What you do, yeah.
I will be doubling back to the places I never got to that have been annoying me, since like August or September. So specifically for me, there's 2 patches of wisteria that have grown. They've managed to get off the ground and up the trees before I even knew I had it. So I will be going and cutting everything I find on those trees that I know is wisteria. Window cut, so then the kind of heavy work is done. So in the spring, I can go and hopefully treat anything that's resprouting. So I'll be primarily doing cutting, and I think winter is a great time. And anytime you're doing invasives, it's a great time to remember to notice some of the beautiful native plants and kind of put equal effort into just enjoying, like you're out in nature trying to kill all these invasives, but presumably it's because you love the other plants that are out there. So if you're working on learning some new ID skills, it's not all about invasives. Teach yourself some beautiful native plants as well.
That's a beautiful point. And also you can learn about birds because they'll be out there too, right? So, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of the time and energy that you spent with us and sharing your knowledge. It's been wonderful. I learned so much today as well. If you want, I'm going to put the slide back up again. If you want to utilize some of the stuff you just learned today and then get some more hands-on training on how to use herbicides and treat woody invasives like autumn olive, go ahead and sign up for this invasive removal workday at Fernbrook for Martin Luther King Day of Service. Ours is going to be on Saturday, and we're really excited to be partnering with the Nature Conservancy. Just real quick, again, to reiterate what Rod said, we can't do any of this without you. We are so grateful to you, the audience, for all that you've done to support us, and just humbly asking for you to keep us in mind when you do your donations. All of your donations help us continue the work that we do throughout Virginia. If you want more information about Blue Ridge PRISM, please visit our website, www.blueridgeprism.org. It just got a whole new shine up and it looks great. So I think you'll enjoy it. So if you haven't seen it in a while, please go ahead and visit us. Once again, if you have questions that we didn't get to answer today or other questions about invasive removal or invasive plants, please go ahead and email us at info@blueridgeprism.org. And we are on social media as well as YouTube. So go ahead and follow us on those channels, and we would love to have you and to learn more about us, and so we can communicate with you on a regular basis. And again, that info@blueridgeprism email is great for if you want to just reach us if you want to volunteer or work with PRISM on things. We would love to have you as well. You can also contact me at Rowena, ROWENA, @blueridgeprism.org. It has been such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much, Nicola, Patty, and Jen, sorry. And I really appreciate the time, and I'm so thankful to our audience for being with us here today too. Just a reminder, this webinar has been recorded, so don't worry if you weren't able to be here. Well, obviously you're not here, or don't worry if you had to leave early. I'll be sending you a copy of this recording in a few days. Everyone who registered will get an email from me. So look for that in your email. And that's it. Thanks for joining us. We only went 4 minutes over, so I'm pretty proud. And once again, a reminder, please fill out a short survey once you exit this webinar. It'll be short and sweet, but we just want to know how better to serve you. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end this webinar now. I know you all have lots of fun things to do in the snow. Happy New Year. And here's to great work in the future on invasives and appreciating all the native plants in our world.